All right, good evening. My name is Nikki Actipis. I will be talking to you this evening about PFAS contamination, environmental injustice, and the call for stronger action, exploring the crisis of forever chemicals and advocating for change. So please excuse me in advance. I'm still getting over some weird, crummy, cold virus, whatever is happening. So I sound like a chain smoker currently. Anyways, so to start us off, if Preza would like to um, cooperate, we're going to start with a roadmap. So we're going to get a little bit of introduction to these chemicals, along with why they are called forever chemicals, followed by some environmental and health concerns, then going into corporate neglect and early regulations, and then bring us up to speed to present day ish, with a rather depressing update. So, PFAS statistics, um, over 97%, around 97 to 98% of Americans are found to have these chemicals in their bloodstream. That is including newborns, elderly, people who are physically fit, all that fun stuff. So obviously, this is a very widespread public health concern, and it really demonstrates the consequences of decades of unregulated use, um, and just unregulation, no regulation in general. It's great. So, why do these chemicals matter? Um, so, we're going to talk about these questions. So, how did PFAS is come contamination go from emerging issue to a nationwide crisis? We're going to talk about the health, environmental impacts, review a little bit of current policies, and the responses there, and then a little bit about advocating for public health and environmental justice. Okay. We're also going to talk a little bit about the origins and uses of these, um, and also corporate neglect, because who doesn't love a good little story about corporate neglect, and progress or non progress made, um, to regulating these fun chemicals. So, what are these guys? Um, I'm personally not going to butcher this whole word this evening. We're just going to stick with forever chemicals, or PFAS is. Um, this group of chemicals is comprised of over 12,000 synthetic chemicals, that have been used since the 1940s in a plethora of products, including nonstick cookware, such as Teflon, water resistant fabrics, food packaging, and firefighting foams. Um, I think at some point there was hubbub about these vegan water bottles as well. So they're everywhere. Okay. So the reason why they are called forever chemicals is because they don't like to break down. Um, they take a long time to break down, years, decades, millennia. And they're also super duper resistant to heat, oil, degradation in general. And this fun buildup leads to accumulation in environment in the human body. Like I said earlier, 97 to 98% of Americans have a little bit of this in their bloodstream just hanging out. Does it stick around forever in our bodies? Jury's kind of still out on that, but it hangs around long enough, right? Especially with the half life being what it is. And these can cause some long term health risks. Right? Right. Um, so, environmental spread is pretty prevalent here. Um, Enters our ecosystems through a variety of different ways, different sources such as industrial discharge, landfill runoff, wastewater, use in firefighting foams at military bases and airports, all that excellent stuff, right? And then, it hangs out in our groundwater and animals indulge in it, and then we indulge in eating the animals and the plants. It's great. We love to see it, right? Um, and it just keeps coming. Okay. So these forever chemicals have been detected again in the bloodstream of nearly every American, including infants, um, which means they're in every facet of the environment, um, which is not great. Not great for humans. Not great for literally every other living thing on the face of the earth. Real bad, right? So substances like this do what we call bioaccumulation, um, which means it just magnifies as it goes up the food chain and also just builds up, right? Because it doesn't break down um, like other organic things do or should. Um, I mean, it breaks down, but breaks down super duper slow, right? So this is a big time public health issue, like big time. And what I mean by that is um, exposure to these forever chemicals has been seen to lead to kidney and testicular cancers, liver damage, elevated cholesterol levels, uh, thyroid issues, immune suppression, and developmental problems in children. Um, Kind of sounds like the same issues going on with we had with lead paint, right? Um, there's been some linkage to lead paint and ADHD um, in children, all that fun stuff. Um, so it seems like we got another one of those issues on our hand. That's my own little 2 cents there. And this is just a short list of health issues. So it's pretty prevalent, not great, right? Um, so the environmental impact, and I want to focus on the environmental impact, but also this comes back to humans, right? Because humans are still part of the environment. Um, so again, the bioaccumulation, gets in the fish or gets in the things that we eat. Um, and it just goes up the food chain like that. And, um, you know, there's not a super ton of research on this because we're just kind of now finding out, hey, this is not great. We need to do more research, see what's actually going on, kind of deal. I'm just gonna imagine might be doing similar things to DDT as well. Anyways, so contamination adversely affects our drinking water, which of course humans aren't the only ones that drink water. Um, but it especially leaches into the ground based on other things we've talked about, right? Landfill, seepage, runoff from ag, runoff from roads, um, environmental pollutants from factories, all that fun stuff. Um, so it gets in the environment, threatens wildlife ecosystems. It also impairs soil and air quality um, in areas around these industrial plants and military sites. Um, and we grow things in soil, right? And we also need oxygen, we need air, um, all that great stuff. So it's just a bad time all around. Right? Um, so before we head on to the next section, I want to mention as well that communities near manufacturers of these chemicals or manufacturers that use these chemicals or military bases traditionally are low income areas and communities of colors, um, which we have seen historically get hit the worst with environmental injustices and environmental crises. Um, they face higher exposure rates that way, right? And a lot of times these groups these vulnerable groups, they have limited access to resources to get them remediation or health monitoring. And it just, continues this cycle of disparities for public health, um, which is not great. So we just keep doing this to vulnerable communities, um, and eventually it comes around to everybody, right? Anyways, so we're going to move on to corporate responsibility and regulatory actions. A little bit of spoiler alert. There's a whole bunch of corporate neglect going on. Is, was, both, and, right? Yes, and. So here we're going to talk a little bit about corporate neglect or negligence. Um, it has come out in recent years. There have been internal documents from companies like 3M and 2 Point revealing that these companies were well aware since the 1960s about the hazard of these chemicals, um, which colored me surprised. Uh, Kind of ringing similar to tobacco industry, knew for decades before the quote unquote the rest of the world about tobacco causing cancer and health issues and all this stuff. And they kept it quiet. So I'm not really super surprised here that these companies were like, well, nobody's asking us. So we're going to keep our mouth shut kind of thing for, um, you know, over half a century. Um, so they chose to withhold this critical information because they didn't want to be regulated, right? And as we all know and love, capitalism prioritizing profit over safety. Um, that's just kind of the reality here, right? Um, Not surprised. I don't think anybody should really be surprised. Um, with that being said, early on, so these chemicals have been being used since the 1940s. So 40s, 50s, 60s was when humans were just like, yeah, these forever chemicals, before we knew they were forever chemicals. Um, they're a good idea. We love it, right? So for decades, there weren't any federal regulations that were really enforceable or enforceable standards for PFS, PFASs in drinking water. And the EPA relied on voluntary guidelines because, corporations really know how to regulate themselves and are really going to be in it for people, not profit, right? Um, Anyhow, so these voluntary guidelines severely limited the EPA's ability to monitor or even enforce any type of safety measures, which, as we see now, has led to widespread pollution and continued pollution, right? Again, these chemicals have a stupid long half life, bioaccumulate like none other, and are just causing all kinds of health problems for everybody. Right? So continuing on with this lack of early regulation or regulation, um, so notifications for certain chemicals came about in the early 2000s ish. Um, like actual, not like voluntary ones, but being like, hey, like you need to stop this kind of thing. Like, no, through the Toxic Substances Control Act. Um, and this was the federal government's first real big stab at doing something about this emerging health crisis or this emerging environmental crisis. And in 2002, the EPA issued the significant new use rules, which put limits on how you had to notify people that you were making these chemicals or importing these chemicals from somewhere, and kind of buttoned out a little bit on this. And besides that, states, besides the federal government doing anything about it, states kind of took the more of the initiative, with New Jersey being the first to set a maximum contaminant level for for these chemicals in drinking water, um, which is great. But if anybody knows anything about the water cycle, um, you kind of got to regulate all waterways altogether instead of just like segments of water because, it moves like groundwater moves, you know, rivers, streams, estuaries, the whole 9 yards, lakes. It's all together, right? Like it can be separate, but it's all together, and water moves, right? So like states took a stab at doing something, but how do you really have any teeth if with your laws if every you've got 49 other governments choosing what to do and or what not to do, right? So this really brings us to market versus safety. Again, chemical industries, and I feel like just about every industry historically prioritizes profit over health of humans, health of the environment, health of the planet. um, and lobbyists really love to push back against regulations and delay necessary safety measures. I mean, that's their job, right? Yes. Um, so, these lobbying efforts really just allow harmful chemicals to keep proliferating unchecked in consumer products and the environment. Um, yes, gotta love it. Um, but in 2023, there was a little bit of hope for the federal government with the Biden Harris administration giving the go ahead for the EPA to propose an enforceable drinking water standards for these chemicals. Um, but as usual, these enforcements, these regulations faced some challenges due to ongoing industrial lobbying. Because again, profits over people, love it. Um, and also, cleanup efforts have been hampered by the same kind of dealio with lobbying. And also, the federal government has yet to classify any of these chemicals as hazardous necessarily, which really limits the accountability for polluters. Um, yeah, feel like there's a tangent I could go on there. Anyways, um, besides that, uh, these things are everywhere, right? We've got landfills everywhere. Um, I don't even know where we would start with a cleanup effort. I think the first step would just be to not use these anymore, um, because I don't think you're going to pull enough of this out of the environment to make a difference. Maybe you could. I don't know. Not my type of science. Uh, Maybe it should be my type of science I study. Anyways, so to put a rain cloud over that little spot of positivity, um, in February of this year, the court said, nah, you can't do that to the EPA around the regulations that they put in place under the Biden Harris administration, with a 5-4 ruling saying you can't do that. You're stretching your powers too far, EPA. And they also rolled back a couple other things. So they cut limits on 6 of these chemical types, um, saying, cool, go at it, no worries. You do you. Um, and there proceeds to be no federal caps on any of these chemicals, kind of deal. So that's kind of where we sit right now with PFAS. Um, it's looking kind of bleak. There are some states putting out some class action lawsuits against manufacturers. Lower courts are kind of allowing it. Some lower courts are, some lower courts aren't. I'm going to say we're going to see some of this stuff go back to the Supreme Court at some point. Um, I believe also the EPA is currently pushing um, forward with trying to get some more regulations around this. As a couple of days ago, there were a couple of news articles about it, but they were kind of hazy on what was going on. But the EPA is still trying to fight this fight, which is, I guess, the silver lining here. Um, yeah, I wish I had picked a happier topic. I actually don't think I don't think there are too many happy topics with environmental regulation law. Um, but this is a really ongoing one that's not quite settled. The science is there, but the science around this is still relatively new, and it's not producing anything good. It's all been yikes on trikes around forever chemicals. Okay. And here are some of my references, and the other part of my references. Um, thank you so much for listening, and have a good night.